Hello and welcome to Dice and Demons. I'm Emma and today I want to show you how to paint a Space Marine like it's a Rubik's Cube or perhaps a game of Tetris. So I start off with a model that's been primed using the White Scars primer, and then I take my pencil and I'd simply start drawing in those little squares. You could also just paint them straight on with some paint, but I find that it's a little bit easier to control freehand stuff, even if it's a relatively simple design such as just tiny little squares, if I have drawn it on with a pencil first. So you could skip this step, but perhaps I wouldn't advise it if you are not really comfortable with freehanding to start with. You'll probably notice that I try to make sure these tiny little squares aren't all the same size and that the sort of angles and lines don't completely line up next to each other. And the reason for that is both that I find that it's more visually fun to look at and more interesting, but also because if you wanted to have all the squares exactly the same shape and size, it would be really easy to tell if just one of them was a little bit bigger or a little bit crooked next to the others. And I didn't want that because it would be really difficult to make sure everything was completely exactly the same size and shape on a miniature like this. So I thought all sorts of different sizes and shapes, that'll be just fine. Then I started painting and I thought, of course, I wanted it to be pink. So I grabbed my Volupus Pink, which is a contrast paint from Citadel, and I started painting. I tried to roughly paint 1/3 of the tiny little squares with the pink color, but this is just a fun project, something I did because, I wanted to just do something that was quite easy and fun. So it's not something I spend a huge amount of time trying to work out exactly what squares to paint in which colors. I just sort of go with the flow. Then the next color I chose was Croxagore Scales, which is a sort of medium turquoise color that I really kind of like. And you'll notice here I made a slight mistake. It's no big deal because I'll be covering it up with other colors later on. So I'm not too fussy about this. This is more or less just a way of making a sketch before I really get down to the painting proper. And the last color I chose was the red color, and this one is called Blood Angels Red, and it's also a contrast paint from Citadel. And while I was painting this, I was actually quite happy with the idea of pink, turquoise, and red. But I noticed it started to look just a little bit dark, and it was a little bit difficult for me to tell, especially the pink and the red from each other. And so that should have been a clue to myself that I would have to fix that before I moved on. But I'm a lazy painter, so I just thought, that is just fine. And so I just went on to the next step. And the next step, as you can see here, is me taking a black paint. This is the Black Legion contrast paint. And I am sort of repainting all the lines between the squares to make it easy for myself when I'm going to be highlighting these squares to make sure that they are as exact as I can get them. Then I started highlighting the squares, and I started with the red ones first. And the first layer of highlights I'm using is called Radar Red, which is a fluorescent paint from Huge Miniatures. I'm using a whole bunch of those fluorescent paints from Huge Miniatures in this paint job, both because I thought it would look fun and just because I really like the effect that a fluorescent paint can have when you turn off the ordinary light and turn on the UV light, because then it'll glow in the dark and it's just useless but fun. From this step onwards, I try to be as neat and exact as I can, because I find that graphical looking patterns such as this tend to look better the more accurate and precise you can be, just because otherwise it's really busy, and I know that. So if you can neaten up the lines a little bit, it tends to help with the overall look of the model, I find. So the second highlight I'm using is for the pink color, and for that I'm using a color again from Huge Miniatures that is called Pulse Wave Pink. And I find that it's quite difficult to get really nice, clear angles, like 90-degree angles when you're painting stuff like this, especially on a rounded model. So this is it. I wouldn't say it's like hugely challenging, but it's quite time consuming. Then for highlighting the turquoise color, I used a color called Gamma Green, also from Huge Miniatures. And I decided to go with green both because I think that it's fun and I like the way that green looks as a highlight color for turquoise, but also because it's difficult to get a turquoise color that pops in the same way as a neon green would. You can of course mix a neon blue and a neon green, but it just tends to look slightly less sort of sharp and poppy compared to, let's say, the green on its own. So that's why I went with that. For the second layer of highlights on the green, I am using another color from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Quantum Green. For highlighting the red, I went with an orange color. Of course, you can always highlight a red color with a sort of more pale version of a red color that tends to go into more like peach or even slightly pink. But I didn't want that because then I wouldn't have as much of a contrast between the red and the pink. And so that's why I went with the orange. And the orange is called Laser Orange. Then for the second layer of highlights on the pink, I went with another color from Huge Miniatures, and this one is called Cyber Pink, and it's just a lighter version of the Pulse Wave Pink that I used for the first layer of highlights. Highlighting pink can be a little bit tricky because it often tends to look more like a pastel version of the color if you go overboard with highlighting, especially if you mix in a bit of white. But at the same time, that can just give it the final touch that really makes it pop. So I find it's really a balancing act, and it's just something you have to experiment with and find out what you're happy with and how it works for you. Then for the last layer of highlights for the turquoise, I use a color called Starfire Yellow, which is just a really nice, bright yellowish green neon color. Then I thought I was happy with the way the squares looked, and so I just wanted to finish it off with another layer of the black outline to make sure that the squares looked as neat and tidy as I could make them. So I once again grabbed the Black Legion paint and went to work. And that's when I realized that this did not work at all. The highlight colors were fine, the squares were fine, the black outline was fine, but the sort of base colors underneath all the highlights were simply too dark. So it looked more or less, just from a distance of a few feet, it looked more or less like I had been highlighting different versions of just some dark color that was really hard to make out from as I said, a distance. And so I needed to make sure that the colors in the blocks of the squares were much lighter and also much more uniform, because the unevenness of the contrast paint just did not help with the overall look at all. So I ended up using 3 different colors as background colors for the squares, and the first one was a color called the red from Kimera Kolors. Then for the turquoise I used Aquamarine from Vallejo, and for the pink I used Warlock Purple, also from Vallejo. So I had to repaint the entire thing once more with all these colors and redo the highlights, but I used the exact same method as I showed before, so I did not re-film all the highlighting because I thought that would also kind of be pretty boring for you guys. But this is what it ended up looking like, and even though I was a little bit disheartened when I realized that I had to paint over all the squares one more time with the sort of base colors, I'm really happy that I did it, because I think the final result is quite fun. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's just something really enjoyable to me about painting stuff like this with these weird patterns. And I think it has something to do with the fact that as soon as I have the pattern down, it's more or less like a coloring book. I just have to fill in the blank spaces, but I know exactly how to do it and what I want to do. And it's really relaxing for me. And it's one of the ways I help combat sort of hobby fatigue. If I'm not quite sure what I want to do, I can always just do a Space Marine with a weird pattern, and it's always a good time. So yeah, perhaps it's a tip for you, perhaps it's just something that works for me because my autistic mind really likes repetitive patterns. I'm not quite sure. And here you can see what it looks like under UV light. And again, I think it's fun. Useless, but very, very fun. And it's one of the steps I always look forward to the most when I'm done painting a model. It's when I turn on the UV flashlight and get to see what it looks like, because I don't do it while I'm painting. I want sort of the surprise from it when it's all done. So before you leave, I would, of course, as always, like to take the opportunity to thank the wonderful people who support Dice and Demons over on Patreon. So thank you so much to Thomas Madsen, Scott Broadway, Gwenna L, Queen's Wolf, Double J's Terrain, Mola Mola, Steve Everly, Bosworthy Rogue, Mando Project, Starcon85, S. Bear, Echinocacus, Elliot Philby, Cyberfossil, and Cinnamon Coffee 87. I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the show notes so you can check that out if you are interested in also becoming a patron. Also remember that you can follow me as Dice and Demons over on X, formerly known as Twitter, and on Instagram if you want to stay up to date on my painting projects. So that was what I wanted to show you today, guys, but I would, of course, as always, love to hear from you. What do you think of the video? What do you think of the color scheme? Do you have any sort of comments, critiques, suggestions, any sort of thing? Please leave it in the comment section and I will try to get back to you. I, of course, also really appreciate it if you like the video, subscribe to my channel, or even decide to share the video with your friends. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!